Michelle Urobsky.
And I'm Lily Carter.
And I'm Sally Kazminski. This is Course Crash World History, and today we will be talking about Latin American imperialism.
Unfortunately, a topic that was not easy to find accurate information for.
You're fully aware that when you think of the word imperialism, you usually think in means of countries on European and Asian continents. But hopefully this will help you explore the South American part of the story.
Because if we don't, not only are we leaving out a chunk of history that may or may not help us on the final, that also means our group is flunking.
Let's start off with the definition of imperialism. It presents itself in numerous ways, culturally, economically, and politically.
The official definition of imperialism is the policy of extending one's nation's power either by conquest or establishing direct or indirect economic or cultural authority over another. Thanks, history textbook.
In other words, a relationship between a stronger power and a weaker power. It's usually started out with the stronger power reaching out to the weaker one.
While these relationships were generally a result of both political and moral motives,
Motives meaning larger powers feeling like they need to rule over a smaller country.
But the primary motive for imperialism stemmed from an uptick in material demands caused by the Industrial Revolution.
the natural resources of the Latin America republics made them targets for a form of economic dependence called free trade imperialism,
which is an agreement among the ruling classes in the countries signing the accord to better exploit laboring masses, that is, the working class and individual farmers.
To meet the demand for these new materials, plantations were set up and locals were put to work.
And if that wasn't miserable enough, heavy taxes were usually placed on the locals to cover the expense of running the colony itself.
Not only was there a demand for more raw materials to keep creating as many factory-made trinkets as possible,
but also a demand to have a market that would buy the products and keep business going.
The colonists rebelled. Well, they were somewhat dependent on their imperialist rulers.
In exchange for the back-breaking work the native people were doing, they would receive enough money to live, and in time came to rely on Western innovations for survival.
Latin American territories were dependent on imperialist relationships for a very long time because of mercantilist philosophies European countries had, Spain and Portugal mainly. When a country needs money, it borrows from other countries and becomes enslaved by debt to these countries.
But beginning in the 19th century, Latin American territories made the majority of their income by exporting natural goods to various imperial territories that ruled over them.
when the United States jumped on the bandwagon, train tracks were laid down to transport the natural goods from Latin American countries to the USA to be made into manufactured products.
It started all the way back to the Revolutionary War as enlightened ideas, including equality of all people under the law, free trade, and free press, became increasingly attractive to people in Latin American countries over the end of the 18th century into the 19th century.
Following the USA split from Britain all the way back in 1776, many Latin American states declared their independence from the threatening imperialist powers of Spain and France, even though there were rumors that the French and Spanish would soon restore their power over their colonies.
Britain, on the other hand, was very interested in investing in Latin American areas, which did not please the United States.
There was a possibility France and Spain could make a comeback, and if that occurred, ties between the colonies would be twisted and feuds would start.
This is what led to the Monroe Doctrine, which declared Latin America off limits to Europe and other eastern territories, and rested on four main principles.
1. The Americas were not going to be considered for future means of colonization.
2. Latin America was off limits to Europe for political reasons, and any attempt to keep colonizing any unclaimed area in Latin America by a European would be seen to the Americans as a threat.
3. The USA would not interfere with any current relationships between Europe and Latin America.
4. The United States would not participate in any wars of European powers against each other.
While the Monroe Doctrine was being worked on, Latin American governments were slowly making their way to independence.
The U.S. was initially overjoyed with this news, thinking that they would soon be able to make economic ties to get the resources that they needed.
Days lasted until America found out the French had invaded Spain and were planning to reestablish imperialist terms with Latin American countries.
Even Great Britain was getting involved in the matter. They wanted to maintain their casual imperialist empire in Latin America as much as the others wanted to establish their own.
The Monroe Doctrine was then published on December 2nd, 1823, in the midst of all of the tension, and it drove away European callers, for the most part.
The United States was proud of this new doctrine being in place, but in the beginning they bit off a little more than they could chew.
The entire Western Hemisphere may have been off limits to the large European powers, but the U.S. still did not have a military or economy with enough power to rule over several Latin American colonies.
After Monroe left office, future presidents added their own little touches to the Monroe Doctrine in order to keep it up to date.
In 1848, President James K. Polk declared that an English or Spanish protectorate over Mexico would be a violation over the Monroe Doctrine.
So what does one do when a doctrine stands in their way? Change it in order to make it a basis for the American dream of expansion.
Except not much happened there, thanks to a little thing called the Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865.
But in that time, the Mexican regime collapsed. Next, we jump
into the early 1900s. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to assert power in Latin America.
Despite the existence of the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt still feared that nations such as Venezuela, which was in the middle of a crisis with its creditors, would become a target for European invasion.
This is the perfect example of social Darwinism, or might makes right. Roosevelt believed that America should be the international police force, meaning that he wanted to protect Latin American nations from European imperialism.
This led to the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the USA would intervene if Western nations
A. did not fulfill their obligations to creditors,
B. violated the rights of Americans, or
C. invited foreign threats that would harm America.
Over time, the corollary had less to do with relations between Europe and the West, but it did serve as an excuse for the USA's involvement in Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, and other countries.
But to get to that, we must rewind 3 years to talk about the Platt Amendment.
The amendment stated that America would withdraw military forces from Cuba, which were placed during the Spanish-American War, under certain conditions.
Be allowed involvement in Cuban affairs in order to maintain American ideals such as equal rights or improved sanitary conditions.
There was a demonstration of assimilation where a stronger power attempts to make a weaker power into their own image. While the U.S. didn't exactly inhabit Latin America, there was still quite the effort to change it.
This is also an example of indirect rule because while the United States was influencing less powerful nations, there was no replacement of political elites.
America had begun its imperial rule with little involvement except to protect economic interests. The motive soon evolved over time, and the U.S. eventually felt obligated to exert more power.
Oh, it's time for the open letter. An open letter to President Theodore Roosevelt. But first, let's see what's not in the secret compartment, because it was too big to fit. A big stick! Time to talk about Panama. Dear President Roosevelt, I must say thank you for getting us out of the Great Depression, because that wasn't too good for our economy.
On theory, could have worked. You definitely made yourself history's favor by solving the problem a little more quickly.
But the whole Roosevelt corollary thing, just an example of really bad communication. Also pretty difficult to say. We started this whole thing as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, as explained previously. And that was all well and good until the Venezuelan crisis of 1902 and 1903 popped up. Suddenly, you saw that the Germans were breaking the Monroe Doctrine Pact because they were approaching Venezuela. But in reality, this whole situation was just a really bad misunderstanding. The Germans were trying to resolve a long-held argument with Venezuela, which Venezuela had through all its revolutionary phases. The Venezuelans thought the Monroe Doctrine made them immediate enemies with the Germans and therefore didn't reply to any of the 17 communications sent by them. The USA saw the Germans' action as a betrayal of the Monroe Doctrine altogether. And then everyone flipped out. Come on, people. I could text 3 people in the 6th grade and no one would run away crying to their Justin Bieber poster. I will cut you some slack, Roosevelt, because you did renounce the Roosevelt Corollary in 1934. After a few separate incidences of U.S. intervention in Latin American countries. And put the good neighbor policy into effect. Of course, that ended at the start of the Cold War, but that's another letter for another time.
Best wishes, Sally Kosminski.
Anyway, a quick explanation about Panama. The U.S. took quite forceful measures there. The U.S. supported the Panamanian Rebellion in Colombia in 1903 and then began controlling the Panama Canal.
What the Panama Canal had on the U.S. was that the U.S. gained control of important economic benefits from Latin America. Also, they gained interest in other islands such as Hawaii and the Philippines for more economic interest.
Let's not forget to mention how the canal became an important part in their economy, providing income and jobs.
And now the other part of Latin American imperialism that you've all been waiting for, revolution.
The first revolt that was considered successful as means of starting the liberation movement in Latin America was actually the Haitian slave uprising led by Toussaint Louverture in 1804 that destroyed coffee and sugar plantations in protest of receiving no rights granted from France.
However, the real crisis started when Napoleon, yes, that Napoleon, put his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne in 1808.
That action assisted the initial spark in Latin American revolutionary means by turning the people against the ruler.
Creoles, who were people of European descent born in a Latin American country, everywhere that were in the uppermost class began to disobey the imperialist rule of the Spanish and Portuguese.
Simón Bolívar brought Francisco de Miranda to the Venezuelan scene in 1811, and together they fought Spanish forces until they won independence in 1845.
Even when the Brits returned a year later, they were still defeated, which gave Venezuelans a sense of confidence to defeat the imperialist force.
Mexico, Miguel Hidalgo, a Roman Catholic priest, led an armed revolt in 1810 that paved the way for Mexican independence, which was gained in 1821.
Hidalgo, even after his execution following the initial revolt, kept on gaining followers, and his forces started to take over cities in Mexico one by one.
Overall, imperialism in Latin America had a much bigger impact than people typically realize.
From the conquistadors to the Monroe Doctrine and beyond, many of today's problems with Latin American countries can actually be traced to damage done by imperialist policies.
Once countries in South America gained their independence and finally started running, they had a long way to go. Some of them still currently have a long way to go.
During the 19th century, Latin American countries were actually doing quite well. But from the 20th century up until approximately 50 years ago, the countries that had worked so hard for their independence saw their economies and governments slowly dilapidate.
1970 to 1998, Latin American countries had an average of one economic crisis every 2 years. For Peruvians between 1979 and 1998, there was usually an annual economic crisis.
Even now, present day, economic growth for Latin American countries is only estimated to be 40% of what it was from 2003 to 2010.
But it's not all bad. For the first time ever, there are more members of the middle class than there are in the lower class.
50% of Latin American citizens think that their improvement in their living conditions will definitely stick.
Twice as many Latin Americans say that they're satisfied with their living conditions than in the past.
Conditions are getting better. We've seen how Latin America has risen up from the ashes before, and we hope that they can do it again.
So when you see Latin America in the news, remember what they've gone through, and maybe there will be a connection between their past struggles and what is going on presently.
And with that, our work is done. Thanks for watching. We won't see you next week.
Horse Crash is written, produced, edited, and filmed by the entire crew: Sally Kosminski, Michelle Yorosky, and Emily Farmer.
We switch off on camera depending on who's actually talking and who's holding up the whiteboard that's telling us what we're supposed to say.
Our graphics team is, yep, you guessed it, the same whiteboard that we use to write our lines on.
We can tell you to leave comments on what we should cover next, but as we stated before, we will not be doing any more of these videos, and this is a class presentation, so you'll just be giving us criticism verbally.
And as always, DFTCYBBTPS WWI. Don't forget to check your bibliography because there's probably something wrong with it.